Radio Retro Future.
Good day, ladies and gentlemen, I am Bonsert of Radio Retro Future. And just today I read an interesting article on the website The Outline called Why Steampunk? Which is about steampunk in South Africa. Awesome, I thought, I don't know anything about the culture there. So I was really glad I came across this article, until I started reading it. It is written by an author from Cape Town in South Africa, in which she complains that some friends have been sending her links to a crowdfunder for a new brew bar called Truth Coffee. That is, oh my god, steampunk themed. This one in particular would be called Truth Coffee Steampunk HQ. Not to be confused with Steampunk HQ in New Zealand, otherwise known as Omaru. Bars like that aren't rare. I know more such places in South Africa, Hungary, the Netherlands. And of course it's perfectly fine not to enjoy something like steampunk. I personally dislike a lot of things, like Crocs, or the pilot episode of Star Trek Discovery. But you don't see me writing an article just about disliking something. So she must have some in-depth criticism, right? Well, let's find out. She opens up with the crowdfunder and how she does not understand why Truth Coffee can't be a normal barista. You know, with plants and tables and chairs and such. Now, my question is, why wouldn't they make it steampunk? Well, she just finds it very questionable. And then she goes on criticizing other steampunk-inspired venues, like there's nothing remarkable about the food or coffee that they serve. Or at least special in a way it garners a word like steampunk in the name. Which is often true. And as an example she mentions the steampunk Benedict that Truth Coffee serves, which is just a normal egg Benedict. Now I don't drink at places like that, so I'll just take her word for it. But you know, that criticism is fair. A lot of things are just called steampunk for the novelty of it. But as the decor of the establishment itself is concerned, variety is the spice of life and sometimes people crave a change of scenery. Steampunk decor is very immersive after all, and a great way to get away from reality for a moment. Sometimes immersion comes from naming things differently, or maybe they do something a little bit different with the coffee to justify the name. And sometimes it's just used as a novelty to attract customers. It is just what happens when something becomes popular.
Don't understand?
She asks her audience.
Me neither. Want to find out more? Me neither.
And why the hell are you writing this?
Well, tough. We're trying to learn together, among with all the reviewers online who are gamily trying to guess what is going on.
She really makes a big deal out of this crowdfunder and I seriously hope it's a failed attempt to be funny. Then she quotes some clickbaity website, which she calls a review, as if that should make a point. Of course I had to find out where she got that quote from, because why would you cite something? After that she attempts to define steampunk. Her description of steampunk here is not that offensive, with references to people wearing corsets and top hats and of course a fondness for the 19th century. But after giving her description, the intentions of the author become really questionable.
Sometimes the best way to understand something is to understand its opposite. According to a steampunk forum called Brass Goggles, the opposite of steampunk is consumerism. Ice hipster, something devoid of style, romanticism, anachronism, and steam-powered machinery. And gangsta rap. We aim to be gentlemen, they aim to be thugs. But the overarching premise seems to really be the Victorian era. I miss it.
Now I found this remark very questionable, so I went looking on Brass Goggles for these quotes. But I found the thread in question, which was called, "What is the opposite of steampunk?" Oh dear, she couldn't even make up her own stories. Also, it's from 2012. There seems to be this impression that steampunk is this never-changing thing, and still think that steampunks are nothing more but goths in brown. But it's really getting an outdated cliche. So, for those people that actually want to investigate steampunk and their ideology, if you could call it that, make sure it's pretty recent. Hell, I wouldn't even know these people are still steampunks by this time. But back to the Brass Goggles thread. And as I started reading it, it became clear right away she only used the first 10 posts or so. And only those that are cherry-picked like this one. I find this very disappointing, not just because she was very selective in her quotes, but also she wrote it in such a way it's like her interpretation of it rather than a direct citation, so it reeks of plagiarism. But of course you would only notice that when you actually check out her source, which she didn't cite. But here is the most egregious part for me. Within this thread there are also remarks like these.
Well, that's quite an odd question. Is it even possible for there to be an opposite of such a subculture? At a push, I think I might say the regular Victorian era is the opposite of steampunk.
So claiming that steampunks missed the Victorian era is disproved by her own source. But even if such sentiments were being uttered in this thread, it doesn't matter. But more on that later. But nevertheless, it's a fun thread and I will put a link down in the description. But I think at this point it's very clear the author comes in this discussion with ill intent. And that makes me curious to why. Well, if anything, she doesn't like how mainstream steampunk has gotten. And a lot of the people that go to Africa Burn, which is apparently their version of Burning Man, do so in steampunk attire. And again, I can't make anything of this other than complaining. But I do find it interesting to learn there's such a thing as Africa Burn. And that's the thing what keeps me reading. But finally comes the point that she reveals her hand.
I'm not above coming up with a high-minded reason to justify my prior decision to something is shitty or ugly. But I don't think it is much of a stretch to suggest that Cape Town's affection for steampunk is ideologically bad and a way for white people to be misty-eyed about a past without copping to it.
So her whole motivation is ideological. Wonderful! Quite frankly, I think steampunk is the least of Cape Town's problems.
In truth, Coffee Steampunk HQ, for instance, there's a large poster on the wall advertising 1652 Blend. 1652 being the year of Dutch India Company's arrival in Cape Town, paving the way for colonization.
Actually, that's the year that Cape Town was founded, not the year that the Dutch India Company arrived. The Dutch were active in that region years prior, and the Portuguese over a century before that. But still, what's your point? Maybe that's the way the owners either inform or remind the customers of Cape Town's history. For all the good or bad it did. It is not an ideological statement. And as we have already demonstrated, the steampunks that you misquoted are not interested in bringing back Victorian era imperialism. And even if those specific steampunks said such a thing, a handful of comments don't prove the entire steampunk community wants to revive the colonial empire. Now, I don't know every steampunk in the world, but of what I've seen, steampunks are from all colors and creeds, and I've yet to meet one that is like Britannia! Fuck yeah! And ideologically bad? Have you ever studied countercultures? In the Netherlands we had the nozems in the 50s. Working class kids that dressed as middle class snobs with fitting haircuts. This tradition goes all the way back to the dandies in the 19th century. Wearing the symbols of the rich and oppressors has always been a way of giving the finger to authority. This is the reason why there were rules in feudal Europe on what kinds of clothes people were allowed to wear until the French Revolution. Now we can argue that steampunk mainly appeals to white Africans. Well, fine, but the fact they are white doesn't mean they're pro-imperialism. Let's take another example. In Indonesia there are students that are dressed like this. This young lady is dressed as a Dutch mevrouw. It's how you address women in Dutch. This movement is called Pleziran Tempo Dulu, or Pleasure Trip Through Time. These students seek to uncover colonial history, after the previous government under Suharto tried to bury it. His dynasty too believed these colonial remnants to be ideologically problematic. These students travel to old colonial era buildings to learn about its history. Architects, for example, use these as examples because these colonial buildings are better than what they currently got. Entrepreneurs buy and restore these buildings to house baristas and the like. It's a way to preserve the good and learn from the bad. Steampunk is very similar that way. People that would like to have a past that is better what they have. But history does not flow that way, and humans don't work that way. But at least we can take some inspiration from the past to improve in the future.
Truth Coffee flagship location is located in one of the most expensive parts of the city. It's not overtly steampunk themed, but it has enough decorative touches to put a person in the mind of the Victorian era. Missing from these are references to the past that is a direct acknowledgement of the fact that the coffee shop is situated at the entrance of the pressed brick building, a slave memorial site. Underneath the Prestwish building is an ossuary containing the bones of hundreds of slaves executed by Dutch colonial authorities in the 17th and 18th centuries. I went there the other day and I saw people drinking coffee and swearing loudly into their phones, and did not seem overly troubled by the fact that underneath their feet are thousands of boxes of human remains.
Oh, I'm starting to see what's going on here. But let's talk about the Prestwich building. According to archivalplatform.org, it's indeed an old burial ground discovered in 2003. Presumably for lower class colonists and slaves alike, some of which might have been executed. But the truth of the matter is, there has been no investigation into whom the remains actually belong to. So we don't even know to whom the memorial actually is. And that's not the only controversy. Very few people actually know Truth Coffee is housed inside the memorial to afford the overhead costs. Nor does Truth Coffee inform the customers about this. I discovered a blog, for instance, that is called The Truth About Truth Coffee, and to my disappointment it was just somebody complaining about the coffee prices. I totally agree this is a sad state of affairs, but what does this have to do with steampunk? Also remember how the author complained about a poster that referenced 1652? Make up your mind! If anything, steampunk could be an interactive way to address these very histories, but I wouldn't do it in a memorial itself, although I'm not even sure the author actually wants to address this history after that 180.
I'm not the first person to point out there might be something wrong here, but the wider online arguments about whether steampunk is racist or not were at a peak in about 2012, aka the last time the rest of the world gave a shit about steampunk.
Hey, I started in 2012. Just like most people I know, by the way. But all joking aside, does anyone actually remember what Prada put out? People have been writing stuff like steampunk is dying since 2013, but now it's 2017, almost 2018, and steampunk is still growing strong and shows no signs of disappearing anytime soon. As for the steampunk is racist, people have been writing nonsense like that ever since 2012, but like this author, they did so for ideological reasons, and people didn't take it seriously.
In Cape Town, however, it's still powering along, and the word has spread to Johannesburg as well. There are 3 different steampunk restaurants in the city now, and there's no reason to suggest there aren't more coming. It needs to end.
And what do you hope to achieve by calling steampunk a rot? Or saying stuff it needs to end? That's my whole problem with most of these steampunks are racist articles. They choose to vilify steampunks, spreading lies and making shit up as they go along. This is the first time though I actually read somebody who wants to end steampunk. Which is interesting. Most authors say they want to change steampunk, but they paint steampunk as white supremacists and neo-imperialists. So, after calling all these steampunks names, do you actually expect them to cooperate with you? Now, if you want steampunks to help you achieve a better future like you claim you do, maybe you could start by cooperating with them instead of shaming them for what they like. If you, for example, care so much for the Prestwich building, maybe you could cooperate with Truth Coffee, or offer to write an information page on the memorial, or encourage an investigation into whom the remains actually belong to, or volunteer at the place. It's like they say, you catch more flies with honey than with vinegar. And by saying that, I kinda hope to end this episode on a positive message. So what do you think about steampunk imperialism? Please let me know in the comments. And if you want me to respond to other articles or certain discussions on steampunk, send me a message. And as always, make it your way.